Good evening and welcome to the University of Wyoming Sheep Extension Task Force, second of two webinar series here. We're grateful that you're joining us from wherever that may be. Last week we had folks from all over the country. I'm Whit Stewart. I'm the Sheep Extension Specialist here at the University of Wyoming. And we have some important members of our Sheep Task Force that have facilitated this webinar series and are on with us tonight. I'd remind those that are listening from Wyoming to utilize them, reach out to them with your questions. We exist to collaborate with our growers and to answer questions. No particular order. We have Micah Most out of Johnson County. We had Jedidiah Hewlett in Converse County, McKenna Marie Julian over in the southwest part of the state in Kemmer, and Brenna Litynski, who is joining us here in Laramie. A couple of housekeeping items this evening. I wanted to mention, please use the Q&A box for questions throughout the webinar, and at the conclusion of our speakers' remarks, we will address those as we can. Recordings from tonight's webinar and the webinar on the 17th will also be posted to the University of Wyoming Extension YouTube channel, so you can access that as well. And please, we ask that you fill out the evaluation. At the conclusion of this webinar, there will be a window that opens. You can click on that evaluation form. It'll pop up in a new window. And we just ask that you give your candid but also generous feedback. We strive to improve the resources that we produce here at the University of Wyoming Extension Sheep Program and Task Force. And so we want to make sure that we can adapt these as we move forward. As mentioned previously, the focus of this series this spring is around the lambing period and the associated challenges and physiological events that are occurring. So tonight I will open it up and give some context, and then we will hear from Dylan Laverell, a former master's student here at the University of Wyoming Animal Science Department and current graduate research assistant and PhD candidate at Lincoln University. Before we dive in too much, I just wanted to allude to a couple of things. This webinar series, we're based in an extensive sheep production state, range sheep state with lots of types of management. We do have lots of farm flocks. We have the spectrum, and I would remind you as you listen tonight, there is no single blueprint for managing sheep production. Our systems will differ widely across landscapes. We have this year, especially in our part of the state, very low precip, but we are not a high precipitation state. We have our unique predation challenges, our unique breed demographics, and all those things contribute to us as we put these together. We try and use representative systems, shed lambing systems, range lambing systems, some of the farm flock systems in our state and region, but these are starting points and they're not prescriptions. And I think it goes without saying that good management in livestock production, and especially sheep production, it isn't copying a particular system, it's understanding the animal within your system. And that is our goal for this evening. Before we get too much more in depth, I want to preface some of this conversation with the fact that we have in our production systems, we want to frame what we're really talking about. We tend to think about lambing as the event, but biologically, lambing is really the beginning of the most demanding stretch in that ewe's year. This evening, Dylan will talk a lot about the periparturient period, which is the scientific term for those periods right around that lambing event, late gestation and into lactation. Those first 30 days postpartum where everything stacks up at once. And that's the context I'd like to frame here. That ewe is recovering from lambing. her uterus, the immune system, tissue repair, all of these things are happening physiologically. And at the same time, she is ramping up milk production. And the challenge is her intake can't keep up yet. And so when we talk about this mismatch in production, it is a natural consequence of this time of year. And I think something that we hope to highlight tonight and talk about as we get into more detail is we have all of these demands, and on top of that, we have a ewe who struggles to get the intake that she needs to meet all these physiological and nutritional demands. I sometimes, one way I like to think about lambing is that it's a controlled trauma, and I probably sound pretentious in this regard because I have not had children, but as a mammal, that isn't my particular role, but it is a normal process, and but it's not without cost. And there's these tissues in the reproductive tract, the detachment of some of these, the placental tissues, and the expulsion of these. You have lots of inflammatory signals being produced because of the inflammation and the healing of the tissues. And so all that energy and protein that could go towards production are being prioritized for tissue repair and immune function. And at the same time, we often see a temporary drop in appetite and efficiency. So right off of the bat, we have these issues that really, I won't say work against the ewe because they are natural processes, but they are not easy, and they oftentimes manifest in challenges that we may, from time to time, overlook. While all of this is happening, the ewe is rebuilding her reproductive tract, and I think it's important that we talk about uterine involution and what that is. It is the process where the uterus returns to its non-pregnant size and state after lambing, okay? And in sheep, that's happening over roughly 2 to 4 weeks. And there's a lot going on here. So the caruncle is sloughing off, the tissue is breaking down. Hopefully that ewe has expelled most of those tissues, and she started that healing process, and she's regenerating the lining and the muscular contractions of the uterus to reduce size. And all of this requires feed inputs. And importantly, this is happening at a time that she's mothering and lactating. So again, we oftentimes may dismiss these demands, but if something goes wrong prior to that lambing or during lambing, such as dystocia, if we're pulling those lambs, we may see retained membranes, infection that just adds to the burden and increases this nutrient cost, and this what we refer to as metabolic stress even further. I alluded to some of these physiological changes, but again, those tired days post-lambing, where we're just trying to keep up or catch up after those long nights of helping our ewes lamb, it's important to keep in mind that there are some tools at our disposal. Again, of course, under the discretion and use of a veterinary consult, sometimes we can increase this healing, especially in the case of retained fetal membranes, utilizing oxytocin injection and to a lesser extent luteolise. And again, under the consultation of our veterinary professionals. But this uterine involution is a big deal. It really is. And some of what we can only see as a ewe who has an elevated temperature or doesn't look good, or who's dealing with decreasing body condition score, many of these instances go back to this stressful physiological event. So the real crux of the issue, though, is that, as we talked about, milk production ramps up very quickly after lambing. Peak lactation, it usually ramps up depending on the breed and to some extent the number of lambs born. This will be anywhere from 21 to 30 days where we experience peak lactation. So the ewe is producing at a level that exceeds what she can consume, and certain animals are at higher risk for this mismatch. Twins and triplets, obviously, those ewes bearing twins and triplets have this higher demand. Young ewes, they're still growing themselves. We had an instance this week. We're hosting a training for the U.S. Veterinary Corps, and I was telling my colleagues prior to this that we're teaching some of our service members how to body condition score, and also looking at some serum ketones or some blood ketone values, or that tells us how metabolically stressed some of these ewes are. And we saw that firsthand. Even under good nutritional management, we saw that our first time lambing ewes, as we brought ewes into the barn and assessed their body condition score, and looked at some of these blood profiles, it was amazing to see that these young ewes really showed their age and their first time lambing, just reflective in their condition. And then, of course, thin ewes, they don't have the reserves to buffer the gap, especially if they're coming into lambing in less than ideal condition on a scale of 1 to 5, being 2 or 2.5. So the result is what we call a negative energy balance. You might hear that a couple of times this evening. And for simplicity's sake, it's just the inability to meet those caloric requirements through intake. She just can't consume enough feed to meet those requirements at the beginning. And again, that's not a failure of management necessarily. It's a normal biological state during this period. Lucky for us, we have some proxies to help us know if a ewe is in negative energy balance. But she compensates for this, the inability to consume enough feed, whether that feed has enough caloric energy or even protein. She compensates for this by mobilizing fat and also concurrently muscle to meet those protein requirements in some cases. Okay, it's not the most effective metabolic pathway. Ideally, she would meet those through dietary means, but it is something that we deal with. And what we see, again, hopefully we are assessing the body condition score of our sheep. We're assessing our allocation of feed and altering that accordingly during this critical time post-lambing. But we would also, maybe something that we can't see is obvious, is milk production decreases. And especially when you think about your respective environments. I know last week we had people from all over the country. Think about how hygienic your lambing environment is. And sometimes there's not enough bedding that can overcome some of the wet weather that we have. I wish we had some of that wet weather here in Wyoming. But the reality is the concentration of those animals in those environments, especially in our housed systems, we see a lot more pathogens in those environments being shed. And here, especially in our Western lambing sheds, and the research that we've done, we start to see some intramammary infections around this time period where the ewe is metabolically stressed, but also is exposed to these pathogens. It may be coccidia. We've had cases of coccidia in our state where just a perfect storm of wet weather, poor or less ideal body condition, and some of these animal health issues occur. I want to be clear about this, though, is that negative energy balance is normal and unavoidable until that ewe's intake catches up. And we aren't always in a practical setting on our farm measuring the exact amount of feed. We allocate feed according to our best estimates, but we use body condition score as a proxy. And that I can't reiterate enough how important it is that we are assessing body condition score, especially during these periods post-lambing, and making sure that some of the dietary contributions we provide are adequate enough to ensure, to incentivize intake of that ewe. I wanted to just briefly mention some of what has been interesting, as Dylan will talk about some of his research here and at the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, and then work that we've seen within our own shed lambing Rambouillet flock here at the University of Wyoming, is that it's no coincidence that we see the same time points where metabolic ketones and especially non-esterified fatty acids or free fatty acids being pulled off the animal. We see the coinciding of those time points also with intramammary infections. And this work was done by Chad Page. If you know Chad, he's at Utah State as the sheep specialist. But we really saw this interesting dynamic, especially as it overlays with Dylan's data. Day 6 to 9 is where we saw our peak somatic cell counts. We also saw some a temporary blip around peak lactation as well. But again, thinking about the systems in which we operate, these aren't isolated physiological events that occur, right? If an animal is challenged in whatever form with stress, a nutritional stress or stress from pathogens and inflammation, these things happen at similar time points. So this is my last slide. So if everything we just talked about is true, and thinking about your flock and thinking about your walkthrough in your pens this evening, which many of you are probably doing, if you are lambing or getting ready to lamb. If the ewe is biologically set up to fall behind, then the question becomes, well, what can we actually do about it? And this is where proactive management really matters, because a lot of what drives this negative energy balance or a decreasing body condition score isn't just lactation in itself. It's everything layered on top of it that we recently talked about. Something as simple as environmental stress can significantly increase a ewe's energy requirements. I throw up this table here just to highlight, hopefully most of us are shearing prior to lambing, but even in full fleece conditions, if a ewe is dry versus wet, we see an increase in the energy required of that ewe just to function. Accounting for these changes in weather, which we see a lot of this time of year, lots of fluctuations, and feeding these ewes in advance of these stressful, fluctuating climatic events is just one of those strategies that can help alleviate some of this stress during this lambing period. We always talk with rule of thumbs, but I do think it's important, especially in those ewes, the proportion of our flock that has twins and triplets, which in our neck of the woods and in many parts of the country, through selection and flushing strategies, we can have more lambs sometimes than we're used to. I think a simple rule of thumb, about 1 to 1.5 pounds of supplemental energy, a grain or a byproduct that's highly digestible nutrient-detergent fiber, is a really good strategy to help alleviate some of those requirements of the ewe just having to digest forage alone or harvested forage alone. We oftentimes say that the optimal NDF intake is about 1.1 to 1.3% of that ewe's body weight. And I've included some examples here of just, the neutral detergent fiber composition of common feedstuffs in our region. You could add lots of different byproducts to that table there, but what I want to draw your attention to is the wheat midds indicated by the blue bar at the very end there, lower fiber concentrations or greater degree of digestible and highly fermentable fiber will allow that ewe to increase her passage rate, will allow her to extract the energy from those feeds without having to feed her starch or other ingredients that could cause some digestive upset. I often talk about soy hulls. In our region, we have to haul those in, but it's just one of those feeds that really is an optimum late gestation and especially lactating dietary component. And lastly, many of us don't have unlimited resources. We work in production agriculture. We know that our costs are ever increasing, but there's simple things like we can do, like processing our hay to reduce that particle size, to facilitate greater intake and passage rate so that you can consume enough. All these things add up to there are strategic management that we'll hear about here as we move into Dylan's presentation. I'm going to stop my slide, but it is my privilege to introduce a former student. We still collaborate with Dylan. He recently started his PhD at Lincoln University with some excellent scientists down there. And I look forward to hearing what Dylan's going to share with us.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Whit. Let me get my screen share. Mike, I might need some permission to do that. But
and I guess I'll, while you're doing that, Dylan, I will say that Dylan is a former student of mine, like I alluded to, and you always run the risk of having a former student on a webinar when you no longer wield any power over him, that he may share some things that, well, he might crack some jokes on my behalf. So this is your chance, Dylan.
Well, thank you, Whit. I don't think there'll be too many jokes tonight, but I appreciate the invitation to come and speak to everyone today. As you guys know, I was in Wyoming for about 8 years, and most of those years, all those years were for university, and I truly have a deep appreciation for Wyoming, and I look forward to talking to some of you guys tonight. So with further ado, here's my part of the presentation. A lot of you guys might have known, Whit just alluded to this, but I recently moved to New Zealand about the first part of November. For those of you who don't know, New Zealand is in the South Pacific Ocean, somewhat close to Australia. Here's a map. Let me get my pointer out here. Here's a map of New Zealand on the left, and I am located outside on the South Island, just right side of Christchurch. Here's the Banks Peninsula. It looks like a little pimple on the South Island at Lincoln University. I know a lot of people here are sheep enthusiasts, so I thought I'd talk about the breed type that's common on at Lincoln. And this is the Coopsworth breed, and it was developed at Lincoln University by crossbreeding New Zealand Romney ewes on border Leicester rams. So this is a common breed, maybe not the most common. Romneys are quite common here as well. But this will be the breed that I'll be utilizing for some of my PhD work. Outside of university, I try to do as many things around Aotearoa, and that's the First Peoples name for the Maori name for New Zealand. And a couple weeks, this photo was taken with a group of postgrads and myself a couple weeks ago as we hiked Foggy Peak in the Southern Alps. And if you can see there in the back, there's the iconic Mount Cook. So it's absolutely beautiful and stunning, and I'm really privileged to be able to study here. But this wasn't the reason why you guys came to the webinar tonight. A little bit of an outline of what I will cover today will be to talk about risk factors for two common pregnancy-related metabolic disorders. These are pregnancy toxemia and hypocalcemia, and I'll be doing that as it relates to some of the master's work that I conducted, where we evaluated Rambouillet, Katahdin, Polypay, Romanoff, and C4 ewes at a U.S. mark in Nebraska, and then also at the University of Wyoming. We'll talk about other regional research finding as it relates to winter range supplementation. And then finally, I'll conclude similar to Whit with some management strategies to reduce some metabolic stress. So, looking at historic lambing percentages, we have some really good resources from USDA NASS that over time has tracked changes in lambing percentage. Although there are some caveats to some of this data, right? We know that in Western states in the U.S., territory states, that these percentages are a docking percentage, whereas in states in the Eastern United States will be marked as a lambing percentage. So this will be at birth. With that, I think we do see some pretty good trends, right? This is just a subset of data. And we know that states like South Dakota, Utah, Wyoming, Montana has seen this increase in lambing rate, reported lambing rate, anywhere from 20 to 30%. And while I won't attribute all of this to genetics, right, we know that maybe there's some larger, more extensive herds that aren't around anymore. And we also could see the implementation of lambing indoors to help increase this as some management practices. Still, I think there are some general increases in lambing rate, and that has been documented through some prior research, one that Dr. Stewart's a part of, where they evaluated prolificacy at U.S. Sheep Experiment Station and U.S. Mark. So we know that there are increasing. And with this increase in lambing percentage, right, we obviously want more twins. Inevitably, we also get more triplets at the same time. This is that study that I was referring to, and they concluded that nearly 1/3 of the USDA Polypay flocks that 3 and 4 years of age are having litters of 3 or more, which is absolutely a big increase than what we saw maybe in the 1970s. This is a very crude diagram that I made on the right. I'm not claiming to be an artist by any means, but hopefully it helps represent that as we increase the number of fetuses, especially in the last trimester of the ewe, unfortunately, that's working antagonistically towards a rumen size and rumen volume. So as we increase not only the number of lambs in that fetal space, we're also decreasing the amount of feed that you can apprehend, right? Additionally, there's also some other things to potentially consider, right? Nothing to change our sheep production systems, but just to be mindful of that as we crossbreed and we might use a terminal sire like a Suffolk, right? We can see that those lambs, this is some US sheep experiment data. We know that these lambs are also increasing in size, right? So it's something to be cognizant of. And even looking at straight bred Rambouillet breed type ewes from the University of Wyoming, triplet litters on average weighed 33.5 pounds, which on 180-pound ewe is quite a large amount for that ewe to be storing inside. So there's some also really good research that was done in the late 60s where they evaluated this on ewes at different stages of pregnancy, and then also the different number of fetuses that ewe was gestating. And they saw a 30% reduction in rumen volume from the non-pregnant ewes to twin-bearing ewes that were in the last stages of gestation. And unfortunately, this reduction in rumen volume will depress the appetite in ewes. Whit alluded to this earlier, but we can't physically feed those ewes enough during that late gestation and especially during early lactation to be able to meet all of their nutrient demands. And that's why body condition becomes so important. While we're seeing this reduction in rumen size, this is coinciding with a period of time where we see these increased requirements. So the diagram on the left is showing crude protein, and then the diagram on the right is showing ME or metabolizable energy. You could substitute that for TDN if that's what you're used to. And then the different colors on these graphs show the increase in the number of lambs or the litter size. And if I overlay these boxes where we show this periparturient period, this is something you've heard a lot about already, but really what we're referring to is the period of late gestation to early lactation. You can see that these are the nutrient times of where nutrient demands are highest, right? So it's a little paradoxical in the fact that we're reducing rumen size at the same time that we want those ewes to have the very large nutrient demands. This is another table that is essentially showing the same thing in both TDN and metabolizable energy. This is NRC values for crude protein, TDN, and ME. I'm just going to check the chat. Cool. We're going to keep on going. Okay. And then one more thing to consider, Whit talked about some diseases. This diagram is showing an immune response, right? So that the nutrient demand, right? The energy demand for mounting an immune response. And this diagram is showing that as it pertains to internal parasites, but we can also substitute that for other diseases as well. So we think of OPP, mastitis, you name it, right? Put it in there. We're also going to have some sort of energetic cost associated with that as well. Skipping. Okay. So we're going to move more into the pregnancy toxemia and talking about these metabolic disorders. So the first one we're going to talk about is pregnancy toxemia, also known as Downer ewe syndrome. Can go by a couple of different names, ketosis or twin lambing disease. And this is the period is the highest risk during the last few weeks of gestation. You can see that photo on the right, that ewe is recumbent, it's laying on the ground, right, and is just unwilling to get back up. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of good data on the prevalence of this. USDA APHIS estimated in 2015 from survey data that metabolic, and I'll quote as metabolic diseases, account for 3.6% of non-predator related losses. However, we know that if we look more internationally at some more intensive data collection, that in dairy sheep flocks in Greece, we see an incidence of pregnancy toxemia specifically at 41.4%. So obviously this varies, and the type of data that is being reported on this varies as well. But this is a significant cost. And the unfortunate part about this is once that ewe becomes recumbent, unable to move, right, there's less than a 33% survival rate for that ewe once clinical signs appear. So with a lot of things, prevention is a lot better than trying to find the cure for that. But this is a little bit of how NEFA and BHBA relate. This diagram on the right is showing adipose tissue or fat mobilization and how eventually turns into non-esterified fatty acids. Whit referred to this as free fatty acids. And it's those are the molecules that are going to be transported to the liver where a cascade of enzymatic oxidation occurs, where it's eventually turned into BHBA, or beta hydroxybutyrate. And this accumulation of oxidation, right, is going to eventually lead to ketosis, or otherwise known as fatty liver disease. So a little bit more on the definitions. NEFA, or non-esterified fatty acids, I want you to think of that as fat being released from the body's fuel tank, right? The energy storage of the body is going to be in fat. And unfortunately, when the ewe isn't getting enough from her feed, or she physically cannot eat much more, right, she's going to start breaking down her own fat for energy. High NEFA levels are indicated by the ewe is pulling too much from her reserves and is under an energy stress or a negative energy balance. And obviously, during this period, we're going to have elevated NEFA levels, but there could be thresholds at which that is too high for that ewe, and it's not necessarily sustainable. So that is being diagrammed where that arrow is, where NEFAs are. And next is beta hydroxybutyrate. I'll refer to this as BHBA. And this is a ketone, or essentially a byproduct, when the body burns a lot of fat for energy. And both BHBA and NEFA can be used by certain organs, specifically for the ewe in the mammary gland as energy. It is a ketone, so similar to a fad a couple of years ago, and it might still be today, but the keto diet, right? This is essentially the same thing. These ewes are on a self-prescribed keto diet, and similar to us, it would be when we're trying to burn a lot of fat for energy. And that's shown there. BHBA and NEFA are positively correlated. So when one goes up, unsurprisingly, the other one goes up as well. And when we see increased BHBA, we know that the ewe is headed towards ketosis or pregnancy toxemia. And when it becomes too high, right, that ewe is at a very high risk. The next metabolic disease I'm going to discuss today is milk fever, or also known as hypocalcemia. Hypo meaning below, and calcemia indicating calcium, circulating concentrations of calcium. This is caused by a sudden increase in calcium demands in the ewe. This is due to the rapid mineralization of fetal skeletons, and also, of course, the need for calcium for milk and colostrum. While hypocalcemia and pregnancy toxemia present very similar, there are some slight differences, right? You know that both ewes become recumbent. However, hypocalcemia, these signs can appear more suddenly. It might start with a slight hyperexcitability, some muscle tremors, and a stilted gait. And unfortunately, that ewe becomes recumbent after that. Unfortunately, a difference from hypocalcemia is that it is a quick death and occurs between 6 and 12 hours after clinical signs. We know that ewes with multiple fetuses need additional calcium due to the increased bone mineralization. Hypocalcemia can also occur before or after parturition. And I think a lot of times the way that we learn about hypocalcemia is from a dairy cow perspective, which is great because it's a great example to use. However, sheep are a little bit different in the fact that it doesn't occur at parturition or calving or lambing, right, in the context of sheep. Whereas in dairy cattle, it generally occurs at calving. Hypocalcemia in sheep has a little bit of a different time frame in sheep. We know if we want to look at some cases of this, that in Australia, 18% of ewes that were sampled in this study had subclinical hypocalcemia, which led to higher lamb mortality. So we know that there's a link there. And ewes that were grazing beet tops, nearly 40% of these ewes were within clinical ranges of hypocalcemia. So there's obviously a nutritional effect there. This is the diagram, and it's not important, right? There's not a test later or anything, but knowing that there's a three-phase response, that when the body signals indicate that there is not enough circulating amounts of calcium, there's this three-phase response in the kidneys to stop to reduce the amount of calcium that's excreted. There's also, we work on the small intestines to increase the number of calcium receptors. And then finally, right, is mobilizing calcium from bone. If we're talking about hypocalcemia, I think it's really important to talk about this metric that we have called DICAD, which is the dietary cation and ion differences in feed. It's the balance of positively charged minerals like sodium and potassium and negatively charged minerals like chloride and sulfur. In dairy cattle, lowering DICAD before calving helps the body mobilize calcium more effectively. And what dairy cattle research suggests is that a lower DICAD leads to higher blood calcium at calving. So that's really important, right, to have a higher calcium so we don't have lower calcium. And a very high DICAD increases the risk of hypocalcemia. So they kind of work inversely from each other. We know that the different types of feed can have an effect on our DICAD. Alfalfa is often high in potassium, which raises DICAD, and corn or corn silage-based diets tend to have naturally lower DICAD. Research is more sparse in sheep, and there's a little bit more nuance as it relates when we try to bring this into a sheep context. However, this may have more application in house systems, potentially in the upper Midwest in the United States. But unfortunately, more research is needed to have a more direct link with DICAD. However, it is something to be aware of. So as a review for the first part, we know that we've seen somewhat of an increase in lambing rate. We know that during this time, as we increase lambing rate, we're also going to reduce the rumen volume, which is also going to reduce dry matter intake during a period where we see already heightened demands. And additionally, if we see or if we have any disease burdens, that will also increase our nutrient demands. And use particularly those with high prolificacy, nutrient deficiencies. So if they're in a lower body condition score or are in a period of stress, are more prone to negative energy balances. So that leads into more of my master's research at the University of Wyoming, where we looked at risk factors and serum energy metabolite profiles and productivity associated with metabolic stress in 5 different breeds of prolific and semi-prolific breeds in the US. So the first study that I'm going to be talking about was conducted at the Laramie Research and Extension Center in the spring of 2023, so February to May. You can see here our lambing rate, and I'll have a lambing rate here in a couple seconds. But unsurprisingly, as we increased the age of those ewes, we increased the number of twins and decreased the number of singles. We used 56 Rambouillet ewes between the ages of 2 and 5. And the important part here is that all ewes were fed a diet to meet requirements for twin-bearing ewes weighing 80 kilograms or 180 pounds. And that's really important because there was no manipulations of the diet. We didn't have a diet as treatment. All ewes were fed a diet to meet requirements. And this diet was formulated by using ingredients that are commonly found in a Western semi-extensive production system. So these are meadow hay dehydrated alfalfa pellets, dried distillers grains or DDGs, and ad libitum or free choice mineral. And with the group of ewes that were used for my study, we had a number of lambs born of 1.85 lambs per ewe, also known as 185%. A little bit on the study timeline and when we sampled, we had three sampling time points prior to lambing or parturition, and those occurred in weekly increments. So 3 weeks, 2 weeks, and 1 week prior to lambing. We took a sample at lambing in the jug, and then we took 4 more samples after lambing or postpartum also in weekly increments. The second study I'll be talking about, and we'll put the data together here in the next couple of slides, but this study did occur at USMARC. So this is the Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska, where we used 4 different maternal breeds of sheep. The first is a composite 4, which is a composite breed that was developed at USMARC for maybe some of their easy care properties, right? It's a shedding breed, and it was white Dorper. I believe the composite mix in there is white Dorper, Katahdin, and Romanov. We had ewes there, and they had an average NLB of 2.8 lambs per ewe, and they lambed in May through June. The polypace, that's a common breed in the U.S., is we had 2 and 4-year-old ewes with an average prolificacy of 2.3 lambs per ewe, and they lambed in April. We also utilized some Katahdins with an average NLB of 2.09, and they all also lambed in April. And finally, we had Romanov ewes that had an average NLB at 2.48. I think that's quite impressive considering they were a fall lambing group or an off-season lambing there, how they were still so prolific. The Romanovs, for those of you who might not be as familiar, are arguably one of the most prolific breeds of sheep in the entire world. And while it may be impractical to raise them by themselves due to the number of lambs they have, you can see here that we did have quadruplets and quintuplets on there. They are primarily used as a component of some composite breeds considered similar to the C4. Diets here were fed as a total mixed ration that consisted of corn silage, mixed grass hay, whole corn, soybean meal, and a mineral pack that was in there. One thing to note on this slide is the different lambing seasons. So with that, we weren't necessarily able to compare breeds against each other. However, we are going to use the breeds and compare within time points. And I think hopefully that becomes a little bit more apparent through the next couple of slides. A little bit about the study design here is that we had less sampling time points. So we didn't necessarily go as far after parturition just due to space at the Meat Animal Research Center. You saw the number of breeds and the number of sheep that they're having to go through the lambing barn. So there's a little bit more restrictions that way. But yeah, you can see here on the right, these are pictures of the different breeds of sheep that were sampled throughout the study. So they're obviously not only different in terms of their breeds, right, what we call them, but also phenotypically have a lot of different characteristics there. And with different objectives for the breeds at USMARC, they do have different weaning weights, and all weaning weights were adjusted for the average weaning weights for the breed. So moving on, we're going to evaluate glucose concentration. So glucose is it's the body's preferred energy, right, for these animals. And so on the y-axis, we have our glucose concentrations in milligrams per deciliter. And then along the x-axis is our temporal axis, right, where we have the days relative to parturition. So on the left side of 0 is prior to parturition or prior to lambing, and the left or the right-hand side is after lambing. We can see here that for the Ramblers at the University of Wyoming, glucose concentrations peaked at day 0. Understandably, right? We know that lambing, there's a lot of energy that's needed for that, and there's a lot of things happening. So we see that increase in energy. But outside of lambing, uh, concentrations of glucose were well regulated. So these red dotted lines indicate what we would consider the normal threshold for glucose in the body. And then on the right-hand side, this is at US mark. So this is looking at the 3 breeds that had time as a significant factor in glucose concentrations. C4s are the dotted line. The polypay is the solid line, and the catodin is the dashed line on this graph on the right-hand side. We observed that the C4Us, they started below the threshold of what we would consider normal at day -14 and -7. And I don't think that's necessarily surprising because we know a lot of the glucose that's produced endogenously or produced from that U is automatically being shunted to the fetus. So a lot of that energy was used, what we can conclude was used for the production or for the lamb. However, we look at polypay and catodins, they both peaked at day 0, maybe not as much as the Rambouillets, but then we can conclude that overall glucose was well regulated in these breeds as well. And a note, we're not necessarily comparing the breeds against each other. We are showing them on the same graph on the right-hand side to illustrate the temporal differences within the breed. This graph is looking at beta hydroxybutyrate, right? This is the ketone, the indicator that we're utilizing fat stores for energy, with the Rambouillets from Wyoming being on the left and the US mark breeds being on the right. And this red dashed line is a common threshold for BHBA, and we want to be below that threshold because if we get above, that indicates that we're in the clinical ranges for ketosis or pregnancy toxemia. If we look at the Rambouillets, we notice that concentrations prior to lambing up to lambing were relatively constant, right? We saw a little increase at -7, but then relatively the same at 0, -14, and -21. However, the real story in this data set is this almost linear increase in the mobilization of fat after lambing. We can see that this increases quite dramatically and then reduces a little bit, albeit still in greater concentrations than at or prior to lambing. And we see some similar trends at the US mark data set. So the polypays continually increased, and it may be a little bit more representative of the Rambouillets, considering that the polypay is a quarter Rambouillet in that composite. However, the Romanovs and the catodins worked a little bit differently, where they peaked at day 0 and then went down again. And I don't know if I have a great answer as to why we saw those changes there, but it is an interesting thing to note. So if we look at metabolic stress, we can conclude that U's were in a negative energy balance, and they mobilize stores of energy in the form of fat to fulfill their energy requirements. In this high amount of ketone bodies being either BHBA or NEFA. I showed the BHBA graphs, but the NEFA graphs are almost mirror images of what I just showed you for BHBA. Regardless, this puts a lot of stress on the liver, right? And when we see a lot of metabolic stress, this can lead to fatty liver disease. And I showed that in a diagram beforehand, but there's this really good study out of China that looked at ewes that were fed a diet meeting nutrient demands, so similar to what we did, and then a diet, and this was in a very prolific breed of sheep that they have in China, that was a reduction in both energy and crude protein, and that would be the liver that is shown on the right. So we can see that but there's a difference between the two. The liver on the right was obviously the liver that had a lot more oxidative stress, right? It looks different. It probably would feel different as well. And if we prolonged this, and if we can really see this oxidative stress that could lead to organ failure or hepatic function, right? And this is showing what happens throughout different physiologies as it relates to pregnancy toxemia. If we look at what we would classify, so what we ended up doing was we classified ewes after parturition. So we took an average concentration for each ewe, and we said they're either in the top 50% or the bottom 50%. We classified them as high or low, high being the metabolically stressed individuals and low being the lower stressed, metabolically stressed individuals. And we evaluated their litter weaning weight. And we found that in Rambouillets at the University of Wyoming, they wean 11.2 pounds more per head of litter weaning weight or of lamb. And if we assume a $200 per hundredweight cost, that ewe is bringing in an additional $22.40 of additional revenue. And that's generated from the metabolically stressed ewe. We also noted that these ewes that had high BHBA lost 11.5 pounds of body weight. So just as many pounds as they added to those lambs is what they took off themselves. And this was from a very drastic period, right? The last one was from at weaning. This one was from day 7 to day 28 postpartum. So that was a very small period of time. In Polypays and Romanovs, when we classified them by NEFA status, these breeds weaned 18.5 and 28.2 more pounds of lamb, respectively. So a little bit higher than our Rambouillets, which isn't necessarily surprising. And that's $37 and $56 of additional income generated. So I believe Whit showed a little bit of this slide here, but what we really need to do is decrease or look at when we have very prolific sheep, or we're raising a prolific breed type, or maybe our sheep are at a lower body condition, and we notice this prior to lambing. This is a period of time that we really need to look at the amount of indigestible fiber as shown by NDF of our feedstuffs. That graph is shown to the right. That can be between 1.1 and 1.3% of body weight. And if we have some lower milk yield ewes, this is from the Polina study, we know that we need to be around 40 to 45% NDF, or maybe we have a lower prolificacy. But if those ewes are at a lower body condition, we probably should consider being somewhere around that 40% NDF or lower. There are feedstuffs that are lower in NDF, and generally those are wheat middlings, soy hulls, barley, whole corn, and dried distillers grains. And we can overcome this as well by feeding whole corn. We can feed up to 0.5% of the used body weight in whole corn without decreasing intake of low quality forages, which is somewhat of a common misnomer. But yeah, we can use corn without necessarily in the right percent to decrease the digestibility of lower quality forages, similar to what we might see on the range. And conversely, while doing that, we can meet 35 to 40% of that ewe's daily energy requirements. So if we figure that out on a 180-pound ewe, that's about 0.9 pounds per head per day. So if we look less from mid-gestation to late gestation and look more at lactational management, we know that during this period of time, energy and protein requirements increase 30 to 50%. We all remember that diagram or that graph from the beginning where we saw those stark increases. And it's hard to achieve sufficient caloric intake, especially when we want to feed 3.75 pounds of TDN per day. We know that body condition score is super important because she will need to utilize that energy. As you can see there with my data from my master's work, that those ewes, especially the more metabolically stressed ewes, lost a significant amount of body weight. And that was to overcome a negative energy balance. We know that peak lactation is occurring 21 to 28 days after lambing, and the number of lambs that ewe is gestating is also going to dictate her milk yield due to differences in placental lactogen that are being excreted from the fetus. This is a really good review or just a synopsis of between different breeds, what that milk yield difference is between the twins and singles, the ewes that are gestating twins and singles, and maybe some of the breeds that we're used to in the United States, we see a pretty big increase from 40 to 60%. So with that increase in milk yield, subsequently, we're also going to increase, and that's why we see that increase in energy demands, energy and protein. Moving more on the mineral side of things, I try to condense and make this information a lot more palatable by classifying median values by breed throughout the entire period that we sampled. And thankfully, when we fed a diet that was fulfilling our requirements, we also saw that on the other hand, on the animal that our thresholds were mostly within normal ranges. We did see slightly higher concentrations of magnesium than what is described to be normal in the literature. And I thought it was really interesting that there didn't, even though we're not comparing breeds, all the breeds acted similar. As we look at that, we know that modest increase in magnesium concentrations doesn't negatively affect ewe productivity. There's some pretty good research that suggests it might increase ewe productivity. And we know if we look at it as an overview, we can conclude that the mineral profile was sufficient across breeds. Looking at some more research that was conducted at the University of Wyoming, this is taken from Lexi Julian's master's work, where she sampled winter range from Wyoming sheep producers in Wyoming and one in Colorado, where they took feed samples and then categorized the different winter ranges as being monocot, where they had over 70% of grasses and sedges, dicot, where they had over 70% of forbs, shrubs, and trees, or somewhere that was in the middle as mixed. And we can see here as we progress throughout the different stages of that ewe's production cycle, the number of operations that were meeting calcium requirements. And I think the really interesting part about this data set is that they took fecal DNA or so they took fecal samples and they analyzed the fecal DNA and then determined what proportion of that ewe's diet was fed to then calculate whether or not that ewe was meeting the calcium requirements. And we see here at a time of breeding where our calcium requirements are not very high, that almost all places were meeting these calcium requirements. As we progress through early gestation, right, we see that there's a big drop off in the monocot winter ranges. And then when we get to late gestation, very few monocot operations were meeting calcium requirements. However, three quarters of the mixed and dicot winter ranges were meeting calcium requirements. So if we're looking at this and evaluating our own ranges and deciding when we should supplement calcium, it depends on the plant species that are there and obviously the production time point, right? We can expect that as we get closer to early lactation, that not only would we not necessarily be grazing the same winter range, but that we would see this increase of calcium requirements as well. And we're talking about minerals and we're talking about calcium, and I think we'd do a disservice if we didn't hit on some of the factors that can affect calcium absorption. One would be a high phosphorus in our feed. So if we want to keep that calcium to phosphorus ratio 1.5 to 1 to 2 to 1, as phosphorus can affect calcium's ability to be absorbed in the body. Also, with high potassium, we know potassium can have a similar effect. So this would be seen in high alfalfa diets potentially. It has the potential. Additionally, oxalates, and I have a question mark here, as we know that oxalates combine to calcium, which will reduce the bioavailability. These oxalates can be found in halogeton, greasewood, pigweed, and kochia. However, when we look at the periods of time that we're most concerned with calcium, I do question whether or not that we have this sort of grazing pressure in the spring. So it's not a big influence, but it's something to maybe consider at certain time points. Looking more at feeding and feed intake, we know that sheep are amazing animals, right? And they have these pliable lips that allows them to select the more digestible parts of the plant, right? And sometimes that leaves us with a lot of indigestible parts of the plant that they just don't want to eat. And it's important to look at our bunks and be able to see when we see a lot of stem left in there and adjust our feeding regime accordingly. We know that intake is inherently variable, and research from our lab that looked at medium quality forages know that we can forage intake can range between 2 and 7% of body weight. So that's where we really need to rely on buck management along with body condition score to maybe reevaluate our decisions periodically. So do we need to consider feeding multiple times a day, right? And if we're seeing slick bunks, we might need to increase that along with the number of ewes and bunk space we have available. If we look at these two here, so if we're feeding maybe in a dry lot situation where these ewes are getting the feed periodically, we can see here that we would imagine the amount of feed that animal is going to consume that has already been picked over. I imagine this is going to be a lot more STEMmy than the feed that they don't have access to. So it's looking over to see what is available for the ewes and making sure they have what's adequate for them. And also adverse or winter weather. If you're looking for a really good resource that I appreciate is the Sheep and Housing Equipment Handbook. That is an Iowa State publication. It's relatively cheap. They provide a lot of numbers as it relates to lot space and feeder space and how it might change depending on if those ewes are limit fed. So if we're only giving them so much or we're allocating so much feed on a more precision scale, or if they're self-fed, how that prior photo looked where these ewes can kind of come whenever they want to, not just when the feed truck goes. So that's a really good resource to utilize. This is the same, obviously you can tell that I was one of Whit's students and stole a couple of his slides in the past. And this is the same slide where we can see that 13 to 18% increase in energy requirements due to shearing when the fleeces are wet or dry, or whether or not that ewe has a fleece on there. We know we can overcome that with 1 to 1.5 pounds of supplemental energy. This can be a grain or byproduct based. And we know that we can increase dry matter intake by grinding that hay, similar to what was alluded to earlier. We might not have all the resources to be able to just get in a truckload of corn, to get in a truckload of soy hulls. So we can utilize different methods in terms of feed processing to also overcome some of these differences. One more thing I want to hit on is stress and stress around lambing. As we all know, as fine wool producers, typically what we see in the Western states, we like to shear as close to lambing as we can to minimize where that shearing break is going to be on the next year's fleece. We know that in order to provide adequate safety for shears and for fleece cleanliness, it's important for us to fast these ewes. We know that due to this fasting and period of stress, that it can influence both the endocrine and immune systems. And we need to just be cognizant of where those ewes are at in gestation, right? I'm not advocating for ewes to be shorn really, really close to lambing, especially if they have multiple fetuses that they're gestating. But we know that as you increase the amount of time for fasting, that we're going to be increasing the NEFA and BHBA, right? These are indicators of the ewe mobilizing stores of fat. So we just really need to reduce the amount of stress, whether that be maybe being closer to the 18 hours of fasting, or whether that be a little bit farther before the lambing period. And facilities, right? I like to use the analogy of when it snowed a lot at home and getting all your boots and your coats and tromping around through the snow all day long. When you come back in, you just feel a lot more tired because of the extra energy, moving through the snow versus if it was a summer day and you're wearing shorts and a pair of tennis shoes. And I believe the U's feel the same way as well. So if we just try to make this as best as we can for the U's and do the best that's available to make sure the U's aren't expending extra energy and having clean bedding as well as seen in this picture to reduce any disease transmission that might be there. So some final concluding thoughts that I have. First and foremost is knowledge is power. So understanding the expected prolificacy of your herd, a lot of times this is going to be through previous records or what we've seen before in the past. This is also periodically getting your forage tested so you have an idea of what is available to be feeding your ewes and if there's any big discrepancies of what you thought versus what's actually there. If you're having any of these problems, I think it's really important to have a good relationship with your veterinarian, but make sure you're checking the big things first. I think oftentimes we can assume that it's a mineral imbalance and just go for hypocalcemia, but it's important that we check kind of our more fundamental basic crude protein and energy to make sure those are where they need to be. Ewes gestating and lactating twins, we know that there's an increase in metabolic stress in these ewes, which we showed through my research that increases the body weight loss in those ewes, especially in older ewes. So do we think about putting these animals in separate management groups? As is the case with a lot of other things, the best way to manage pregnancy-related metabolic dysfunction is through prevention. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and it's the same thing here. So ensuring the ewes are in a proper body condition score, maybe closer to that 3.5 as we get closer to lambing is adequate, right? Just reducing the number of ewes that are 2 or below is also very important as well. Ensuring proper nutrition, and that could be looking at NDF values. We talked about group management and looking at higher risk ewes based on expected litter size. And Whit had made the comment earlier about what he saw with the first time lambing ewes and how they were maybe having a harder time adjusting to this period of negative energy balance. Excuse me. So maybe looking at separating those ewes that might have a harder time on your operation and how that how you can manage that in a better way. So with that, there's a couple of acknowledgments that I need to say. Obviously, my research team, I was very influenced and my work here would not have been able to be done without my main supervisor, Dr. Stewart, and then also our very close collaborator, Tom Murphy at USDA ARS, along with the farm crew at UW, so Callie Kepke and her team, and the US SMARC Sheep Unit in Clay Center as well. A lot of this research was funded by USDA NEFA grant, along with the Western Sheep Industry Research Fund, which is closely related to the Wyoming Wool Initiative, and of course, the Wyoming Agricultural Experiment Station. So with that, thank you for allowing me to speak with you guys today. It was a great privilege to be able to speak to some of you guys. And yeah, I'll take any questions that you guys might have.
There was a question in the chat asking about where we might source soy hulls in our region. As we're all well aware, there's not much soy hulls grown in the Intermountain West, so they're coming from the eastern part or central part of our country. We get ours out of a feed mill in Pine Bluffs, but I would say that there are opportunities to call a local elevator, and oftentimes they can handle those ingredients in bulk if they can get them, and that is a good place to start. So I think this was the Fisk family over in the western part of our state, so maybe Idaho might be a good place. And this would also be a good chance for me to reiterate. I alluded earlier that soy hulls are a really, really good digestible NDF source. So they have a lot of digestible fiber, and very good proportions of the macro minerals. It's just a really versatile feed. I Wheat mids are lower in NDF, but don't necessarily have the same NDF digestibility. So wheat mids could be utilized in some of these supplements, 30 to 40%. A lot of our pelleted cakes that we use as winter supplements come out of Montana and utilize a high amount of those wheat mids as well. So um, sugar beet pulp might also be a good option for you as well. Good fiber, good energy. So please, last week a question was asked, could you share with us some creep diets and other things? Please send us at the task force an email and we can work with you on putting something together. Dylan, excellent job. Can I ask a question while we're waiting for some other ones, and then I'll let um, Brenna, you jump in and moderate these questions, so I don't talk too much. But did you see? We know we have issues in first-time lambing ewes. In the West, we lamb them at 2 years of age. Did you see the ewes coming into their second lambing have some issues with metabolic stress? And could you just address that quickly?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it depended on breed and where we saw that. So a little bit of the differences between the studies. So the Ramblers, they lambed the first time as 2-year-old ewes, whereas if we looked at the U.S. Mark studies, all those ewes, except for the Romanovs, were allowed to lamb at 1 year of age. So the first so they were second parity ewes that were lambing as the earliest age at the U.S. Mark studies. We saw some, but there wasn't like a real big trend. I think that's definitely something we need to look at going forward. But I'm just looking at some of the NEFA concentrations here from the study and looking at the age component there. We know that, yeah, I mean, I know we thought we saw some of that stuff earlier, but I'm struggling to find any real differences, age-related differences, maybe since
That,
we
that's
first
that's
presented this
That's
information.
fair, Dylan. I would just remind the audience, if you have some younger ewes, I know it's not always practical, especially if we have a small flock, to sort those out and feed those differently, but simple things like allocating optimal feed space, making sure you have enough bunk space that they're not competing, um, creating an environment that there's equal consumption when you're feeding a harvested feed. I'm looking at, these lush pastures of New Zealand, and your solution looks a little different in color, but you would increase the feed allocated in a pasture, right, and decrease stocking rate if you wanted to make sure that everybody had a greater chance to get enough feed intake. So those kind of principles apply to all our production systems, especially those that may be listening from back east.
All right.
All right, Brent, I'm gonna shut up now.
No, you're good. Brenna Litynski from Albany County. We have some questions in the chat. The first one is there a way to test for toxemia?
That is a good question. So what we used for us was we took blood samples and spun that down into serum. Um, Whit, I might defer this one to you. We did use a commercial testing facility down at Texas A&M to analyze that, but this might be something you work closely with your veterinarian on if you see something that's suspected. The first route, it's hard because getting a clinical diagnosis often takes more time than what we should be able to treat those animals in. Um, we need to ensure that when we see those animals lagging in the initially is when we treat them. And Whit has a lot better understanding of what we need to be treating them with. So Whit, I'll give that one to you.
So good answer, Dylan. But also keep in mind that they make some shoot side tools. These are usually monitoring strips where if you're comfortable drawing whole blood, you could it's a strip. I don't want to say it's similar to pregnancy diagnosis, but it could. Abbott makes this little monitor that you put the strip in after you put it in some whole blood, and it gives you a shoot side measurement with a high degree of accuracy and precision. So those ones could also do glucose. So low glucose, high ketones or BHB are good indicators. And these shoot side monitors, I was just looking as that question was being asked. for a couple $100, you could have that and have some of these strips ready to test some of your ewes. I think as technology gets better, our diagnostic tools are going to become more available, more user-friendly, and allow us to make immediate decisions, hopefully in advance of them showing clinical signs of illness or going down. So good question.
Another diagnostic method that you can use is smelling the ewe's breath. If it smells really sweet, that can be an indicator of pregnancy toxemia as well.
And a good
And
segue
some
into
people can
the sheep
smell
jokes.
that.
Sorry.
Some people can smell that and other people can't. I don't know if I can pick up on that as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
worth a shot, Dylan. I'll stick
Worth
to the
a shot,
modern
yeah.
apps, but yeah, that's very, very practical.
Our next question is an IV of calcium basically the only treatment for ewes suffering from hypocalcemia?
Whit, do you want this one as well as it goes along the lines of the last one?
Yeah, so intravenous infusion of it's a mixture of calcium solution. There's an injectable calcium borogluconate, which is a lot of volume being injected that could be administered subcutaneously. I'm not sure about intravenous administration of that. Options are limited, but I will give one anecdote, and this isn't necessarily science-based, but we have all had those issues where you has gone down. And we always try and say, well, is it pregnancy toxemia? Is it a limitation in energy, or is it just calcium? These manifestations of these metabolic diseases, they definitely work hand in hand. So I oftentimes tell producers if a ewe is recumbent or she's down, giving both the injection and some propylene glycol, making sure that even I've seen greater success helping use with slings and making sure that they can maintain circulation to their legs and be able to stand. I think the longer they're down, the less the probability of getting them right. But also when they're about to have this clinical issue, you start to see them stagger a little bit. We know when sheep isolate, they're showing some signs early on, and if you can intervene early, that is the best case. But as Dylan alluded to, I'm sure our clinicians have greater success of fixing this, maybe than we do on our own, but success rates are not high. And I know we don't love to talk about that in our industry, but with all the producers I've worked with, it isn't always a super high success rate. So I would allude to the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Awesome. Someone commented that they have Hamp Cross. They don't have much vegetation in New Mexico. The sheep are housed and they are at late gestation with their ewes and too early lactation. Do you suggest a beet pulp?
That last beet pulp, did they say?
Yes.
I wouldn't prescribe a specific kind of feed. I would first look at what is the quality of the hay that you're feeding. And there's some good free ration balancing programs online. Montana State University has one. But I would first test your feed or work with your county extension agent to see, is there adequate protein in this? My guess is because you're not dealing with a super prolific breed of sheep, I don't assume that many of these hamps have a lot of triplets and twins. Uh, Very easily could have twins, but I would recommend definitely testing your feed first. But a little bit of supplement, even just a little bit of corn supplemented with your hay can go a long way in this last third of pregnancy.
Okay. Dylan, can you elaborate on the low level of supplementation to pregnant ewes on grass dominant range in the last trimester? Any practical implications this might mean for operations?
Yeah. The low level of supplementation. Yeah, so generally all these used predominantly, I would say, in a range setting in Wyoming. They're getting the majority of their nutrients from the forages that they're grazing. So, springtime, a lot of these range producers are going to be lambing in May. Maybe in years like this year where you guys are having out in the West, you might be seeing a little bit earlier green up if there is as much of a green up there. Nonetheless, there's a lot of forbs and shrubs that are out there as well. So it really doesn't take that much external inputs. So whether that's feeding a half to a pound of corn, whole corn per head per day, or some sort of similar supplement that we can add to those ewes to make a pretty drastic change, right? I One common thing that we forget about, that corn does have protein in it, right? Albeit maybe not as much protein as alfalfa or other sources, but it's still a decent source to help that rumen function as well. So making sure that we have not only enough protein, but also the energy, the highly digestible energy that's found in corn. Um, yeah, hopefully that answers that question. Whit, do you have anything to add there?
No, you're absolutely right. And I'd paint a scenario even for some flocks that are feeding a lot of harvested hay right now. If stocks are getting low and all you're left with is, a medium to low quality hay, like of, 7 to 10% crude protein, um, and there's not a lot of green or carotene in that forage, I would recommend making sure that your mineral program also has vitamins. Sometimes we say, well, I'll just put out a lick tub, or not a lick tub, a salt block. Making sure that you have some fortification with vitamin E, in our region where we're just starting to green up, and sometimes the hay stores that we feed this time of year aren't the best if we've been short. So good mineral, good vitamin supplementation is critical the last part of pregnancy and into lactation.
Our next question is, what, if any, mineral antagonisms on calcium or magnesium should we be aware of in Wyoming range systems?
Oh,
It's a
Dylan.
good question, and one that yeah, there's a ton of information on. So one thing I would be looking at, right, especially as it pertains to, I'm gonna exclude a lot of the oxalates from there because I just doubt the amount of grazing pressure that's occurring when we're seeing these heightened calcium demands on that. Maybe if you're in a different part of the country, that might be more pertinent to you. But looking at potassium, I think potassium's a really good one to evaluate, because we know that increased levels of potassium can alter and play with calcium absorption in the small intestine through circulating amounts as well. So if we look at feedstuffs that are high in potassium, like alfalfa, we just need to be cognizant of that fact. And if we're seeing, yeah, just maybe we're not 100% reliant on an alfalfa mixture there. That's one example. Making sure our calcium to phosphorus ratio is at least a 1.5 to 2 to 1 in there. Alfalfa, ironically, is really good at a calcium to phosphorus ratio, being a little bit like 4.5 to 1 potentially for the calcium to phosphorus ratio. So that's interesting there. Sometimes our grain byproducts, right? If we're feeding a lot of wheat or something similar, we might have a lower calcium to phosphorus ratio. Other than that, do you have any like specific plants that are out there, or when we're looking at our mineral tags or for producers, are
Um,
there any
the
suggestions?
only, I guess I'm not thinking as much antagonist as I am. There will be circumstances in these cool evenings in the spring where we have a warm temperature during the day, but still really cold nights. Very common in our spring in our area. We do sometimes see more so in our perennial grasses and annuals, like if you were to plant some ryegrass or some oats as a nurse crop in the spring, we see really low magnesium levels. And not that we see a lot of grass tetany in our region, but that is something to keep an eye on, especially in younger replacement sheep, or if we are a range lambing flock and we're seeing that in the springtime. So that's the only practical circumstance that I would chime into what you said, Dylan, as well.
The next question is, does a flaxlick product high in omega-3 fatty acids help use postpartum?
Oh boy. Well, since we don't endorse necessarily trade names, being objective extension folks, I know we've talked about specific feed ingredients, so we're not getting paid by any of those promotion boards this evening. But, um, you know, so DHA and EPA, the fatty acids that we oftentimes refer to as omega-3s, can help with oxidative status or just kind of reducing free radicals that build up in late pregnancy. Um, Sometimes feeding more of a nutrient than what we know is required and actually utilized biologically doesn't always lead to positive outcomes. And we've seen this in a lot of minerals. I will say sometimes how do I say this? Sometimes the claims associated with feeding excessive amounts of one nutrient or another aren't necessarily rooted in economic outcomes, right? So I'm skirting around this question only to say that I think if we are using a lick tub at a time when we need to ensure that there's uniform consumption and that these are fortified to appropriate levels to meet requirements, I think sometimes these lick products have a lot of merit. Where I sometimes struggle is if we are doing it indiscriminately without keeping track of costs. But I believe this question referred to use postpartum, and I absolutely think a lick tub, especially when those use, we see that suppressed intake for a period of time, and even if it's contributing a little bit of energy, but carrying those micronutrients, I think it is a really good option. But I would say it's probably going to be more effective in those proportions of the flock that have had twins and have had triplets.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Whit and Dylan, for sharing your time and your expertise. I know everybody probably really enjoyed hearing from you. If folks want to reach out, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my email was on that last slide. Maybe I can bring that back up again. All right, here we go. Hopefully you guys can see that. There's my email. Feel free to reach out to me there. Additionally, one of my pet projects lately is doing a little bit of a blog slash Substack. So if you're interested in that, from articles periodically that I write, feel free to subscribe there. That QR code or that URL below should take you there. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, and you can find me Whit.Stewart at UWyo.edu. And again, I'd encourage you also to reach out if you're in one of the areas of our task force members. They're great resources and we communicate on everything. So collectively we can get you answers and localized answers.
On behalf of the UW Sheep Task Force, thank you for attending and participating in this webinar. We really appreciate your time, and we would really appreciate if you would complete the evaluation after we close the webinar. It helps us direct the work we do to be more relevant in addressing the needs of Wyoming sheep producers. This webinar will be posted on the UW Extension YouTube channel for future viewing, and we hope that you have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.